Okay, folks, I'm back. So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about CSS. This is the first of two CSS lectures, and maybe actually more. Maybe I'll do some more kind of demo-y stuff later. So this is a way bigger topic for us than HTML. There's a lot more complexity and many more edge cases, kind of finickiness to CSS, and so in this first lecture, this first part, I'm going to be talking about just one part of CSS, about styling. And we'll have another one where we talk about layout. So just to review, we use HTML on the web to structure our content, and we use CSS to help us present that content. So we try to divide those two functions as well as we can. It's not always possible to really keep them fully separate. There are many excellent resources. The MDN, the Mozilla Developers Network, remains one of the best ones, but Learn Layout is fantastic for CSS. CSS Tricks is really a great website, and there are really neat classes on Code Academy. And there are many other cool sites that you can use to learn more about CSS. For this moment, we're going to learn a little bit about the CSS syntax. So we learned about the HTML syntax, the way that HTML elements are delimited by tags, and in CSS there are similarly necessary syntactical elements that you have to pay attention to. And then we'll learn a little bit of what we might think of as the jargon of CSS, some of the kind of like lingo that you have to get your head around in order to be able to really operate in CSS. And again, where to look stuff up. And the answer to that basically is just the MDN, Mozilla Developers Network. Okay, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It's the Cascading Style Sheet language. So a style sheet is a word that comes to us from the old publishing industry, where in a journal, even today, a scientific journal will send you a style sheet that tells you what you have to do to meet the requirements for submission. When you submit your PhD dissertation, there are similarly style sheets about your margins and stuff like that. So the CSS is a style sheet that determines your style for you. They're cascading because in CSS, values override each other. They cascade down this waterfall from one level to the next, and there are kind of multiple ways in which that cascade functions. And we'll try to, you don't have to understand everything. We try to come to grips with it a little bit. All right, here are two versions of the same website. The first one is the New York Times with the CSS applied, and the second one is the New York Times without CSS applied. And as you can see, it's unreadable without CSS. So CSS, like sometimes you might think of it as, oh, it's just presentation, but it's really fundamental, and without CSS, it's very hard to make a usable website. The basic unit of analysis in the CSS is the selector and the selector statement. So when you look at a CSS file, it will be it will have this form. It'll be a form, take the form of a bunch of sort of stanzas. Each stanza is preceded by something called a selector, and then there'll be an open curly brace and a bunch of statements and a closing curly brace. And let's look at that just a little bit more closely. Each of the statements inside the inside the stanza has the same format. It opens with a key, a little bit like in JSON, right? Which is a property whose value is being set, and it closes with a value, and the value takes different forms depending on what the key is, what the property is. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. And the thing to note here is that every line must end with a semicolon. For years I would make mistakes all the time forgetting to put in semicolons, and I had so much grief because of my stupidity. So if you can, try to be a little bit less stupid than me, that would be great. That would be like an accomplishment for me. I'd be very proud of myself. Okay. So here's the anatomy of the selector. This is actually not such a great visualization that I came up with. The selector in the front can be really complex, and we'll talk about some of these, but then there's always the brace, always the property name, the colon, the value, which has to be in some approved format, the semicolon, and after a set of those statements, the closing brace. That says, so those braces, those curly braces say, I have to identify the selector. Everything between the braces will be applied to elements that match that selector. Okay, let's see what we mean here. So they're pretty simple in principle, but they can actually be kind of complex to understand in action, and you'll see, you'll slowly kind of get the hang of this. So the first kind of selector that's important for a person to know is the one that we saw before, and which are called element selectors, and they're pretty easy to understand just looking at them. You can see here that the selector is just the name of an element, a tag name, right? An H1 or a P. So what these statements say is everything inside the curly brace will be applied to elements of type H1 or type P below, right? So H1 elements will have large font. They'll be twice as big as normal, and they will be colored red. And then we have this weird statement that makes no sense. We're going to make paragraphs be 5 times as big as normal. So we'll have this weird situation where H1 elements are smaller than paragraph elements. That would be a really dumb way to do your CSS, but I just want to show you what you can do with CSS here. And then below we have a slightly more complex selector. Dot cool para, color green. So this selector will be applied to all elements which have a class attribute of cool para. So that could be div elements, it could be paragraph elements, it could be header elements. Anything that has an attribute in the tag, a class attribute, whose value includes cool para. And very similar, but somewhat more specific, are ID selectors. So this one will select the element that has the should be unique ID of my fave, and it will get the font color will be yellow, the background color will be black. It'll be kind of hideous actually. And so we have here then some actual HTML, and so we just take a quick look at what it looks like. Yeah, so this is what that will look like if you were to render it. It'll be hideous. And you can see here's the paragraph with the ID my fave, and the other paragraph with the class of cool para. And you can see how it's green there. All right. Here we have similar kinds of things at work, and we'll see here that this is what's called a descendant selector. We're looking for a div whose ID is main, and we're going to search inside that div whose ID is main for a paragraph, and any paragraph inside div ID main will be colored red. But if that paragraph in addition has a class of blue, then we're going to color it blue. And because this selector is more specific than the first selector, it will take precedence. So this color equals red actually it does apply to both paragraphs inside the div, but it's going to be overridden in the second half, in the second case. And we can see the effects of that in the rendering on the other side. So this is where it becomes important to start understanding the idea of the cascade, right? At the bottom of the lowest priority is a rule that applies only to an element or to a tag name. A level above that is a rule that applies to a class, and above that is a rule that applies to an ID. Above that is what's called inline CSS, which we won't really use much in this class. And then within that, there are fine gradations because selectors can be very complex and have combinations of ID and class elements and so forth. And then on top of that, there is this terrible thing in CSS called the important rule, where you can, at the end of a value declaration for a property, you can put exclamation point important, and that will never be overridden, no matter what comes after it in the rest of CSS. And sometimes, one finds oneself using this in an emergency when you don't understand what the heck is going on with your code, but it's bad form and it usually comes back to bite you later on. So you can see already it's like a system of pretty simple rules that very rapidly becomes complex, and you can already see that there are lots of properties in CSS. So in the rest of this lecture, I'm just going to talk about a tiny number of them, and the first thing I want to talk about is colors. So if we go back here, we can see that here I'm using color, and I believe here I have two color related properties, the font color, which is just named color, and the background color. And here I'm using these sort of semantic names for color that are really obvious to us: green, black, yellow, white. But there are lots of other representations of color in CSS. There are two that matter for us. The first is the hex representation, and the second is RGB, and then there's a modification of RGB called RGBA. They are really the same, they just use slightly different numbering systems. In each case, there is a set of values that represent the color as a whole. There's a red part, a green part, and a blue part to the color, and the higher the number, the more of that color is going to be shown. The more of that color there's going to be. So in each case, the possible numbers go from 0 to 255. In RGB, you can see that really easily. So here we have a color with no red, some green, like a medium amount of green, and all the blue that is possible. We have that exact same color here, but it's written in hexadecimal. So each digit, instead of going from 0 to 9, goes from 0 to F, where F counts for 16. So we have 0, then 1, 2, 3, F counts for 15 rather. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. A, B, C, D, E, F, and then back to 0 again. So it's a base 16 number. It's 2 digits, so it has a total of 16 times 16 values, which is 256 values. In the same way, this goes from 0 to 255. You'll find most developers actually use these hex colors. Once you get familiar with them, they're not so hard, but in class we'll tend to use RGB more because it's a little bit easier to tell what's going on with the color. And I am kind of fond of RGBA, which is red, in which there are 4 values. red, green, blue, and then what's called an alpha channel, which is just a measure of opacity. So you can make something a little bit more transparent by choosing a number less than 1. And there are other representations also, HSL and HSLA, but we're not going to talk about them. So we have colors, and then on top of colors, it's important for us to think a little bit about fonts and borders. This is just the beginning of CSS. So we've got a font color here, which is just a gray, a background color, which is kind of ugly yellow. We're aligning the text in the center, we're underlining the text, and we're choosing Times New Roman as our font. But if we look at it, we can see that there's something kind of weird going on. There's a series of names separated by commas. That's because if the computer that is displaying this web page doesn't have Times New Roman available, the browser will fall back to Times, and if it doesn't have Times, it'll fall back to the generic serif font. That is a font that has serif font has little decorations, like you can see that little flourish on the end of the F, and a sans serif font would not. And then here we've made the font style italic. We've made the font size kind of big, 1.25 times as big as normal, and we've added a green border that curves with a border radius of 20. It says 20%, should be 20 pixels. And we can see some of these kind of these principles being applied here in this little piece of dumb code. The main point of this code is to show you that there are different ways of writing sizes, just as there are different ways of writing colors. And it's probably more important to understand sizing a little bit better in CSS than it is to understand the colors, because this different sizing rules actually work somewhat differently. So the easiest thing to understand is pixels, px, and that just allots a number of dots on the screen to the element. So when it says font size 20 pixels, that means that a given letter has a range of 20 pixels to work in height. This EM is really, really useful, and I try to move into EM for most things, except for sometimes for margins and borders. But it says make the font here. It says make the font 0.6 times as big as it otherwise would be, as would be expected, and that can be super helpful because it's like relative to the elements around it. And here we have a big EM. For width and length and height, but especially for width, we often instead use a percentage. So this 20% width says make the element 20% as big as the element that's containing it. So we can see the percent box. You can see that that's about a fifth of this total distance here of the distance of the box that it's inside. This, on the other hand, this 70 pixel box is always going to be exactly 70 pixels high. That can be a little bit of a problem because different screens have different resolutions. So this has a really high resolution, this screen, and so the 70 by 70 is really small. On an older, lower resolution screen, it'll be kind of big and chunky. And to deal with that kind of problem is this cool, relatively new, not really new anymore, but newer viewport unit and we have viewport width and viewport height below it. So it's just a percent of the screen, of the size of the screen. So you can see that is about 30% of the width of the screen. Okay, so I hope that was a little bit of a helpful introduction. I want to just quickly show you something that we will also be using in class. This is a little repository called CSS Styling, which is part of the class. Let's click on the link, and it takes us to this. Sorry, it's going to be pretty hard to see for you to see. Digital history / CSS-styling. And what you're gonna do is exactly what you would normally do when you wanted to work with a repository. What I'm going to suggest is that you fork it. I'm going to fork it as myself. I may already have a copy of it. This fork may not succeed. And then once it's forked, I'm going to get the clone link. I'm going to go into VS Code. I'm going to open a new workspace. No, I'm going to, I forget, actually I kind of forget how to do this in VS Code. New window, maybe I'll make a new window here, and I will open the terminal, and I'll do it manually. I'm going to type, let's see if I can make this all bigger, git clone. Okay. I'm going to open a folder. I'm going to open the folder I just cloned. Okay. And now, ta-da, here we are in the repository. I can, for instance, click on index.html, and I can show the live server preview. And here we can see what's happening. So that's what's happening in HTML and index.html, but the work that we're going to do is actually going to be, whoops, I don't want that there, is going to be in the style.css file. So what we want to do is take a look at the kind of what index.html is telling us and try to fix it so that it looks like it's supposed to. So we can kind of see this paragraph is class red. So I bet what we want to do is turn the paragraph with class red into a color, and let's do a red color, which is something like this. We'll have a hash. We want some, or here, maybe this will be easier to understand. We'll have an RGB value, and we'll make it give it a really high red value, and low green and blue values. And you can see that VS Code pops up a little box that shows us what color that's going to be. I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to open index.html. Oops. And I'm going to do the preview again. And we can see that the paragraph is turned red. But then let's look. We need to override the class instruction with an ID instruction. So let's do that here. And we're going to make something green. Let's say RGB 43 234 19. Make something pretty green. And ta-da, it updates. Sometimes that doesn't update, but it did right there. And you can continue as along those lines. We're going to do this again in class, but there's no reason why you can't do it on your own. You can completely finish the kind of exercise without coming to class at all. All right then. Yeah, that's a little bit of an introduction to basic CSS, and it's enough to get you started. There's a whole other topic on layout. I really want you to stop and play around with this stuff first, because layout is way more difficult. All right then, enjoy.